It was an ordinary morning in a small town where the sky looked pale blue, and the sun lazily rose over the rooftops. The streets were quiet except for a few school buses and children walking with bags hanging from their shoulders. In one of those buses sat a boy who never drew much attention. He wasn't the top of his class or the loud one in the back. He was just the kind of student most people barely noticed, always quiet, always thinking and always lost in his own little world of questions. At school, he didn't have many friends, not because he didn't want any, but because most people found him too serious. While others talked about sports or games, he would talk about how the moon changes shape every night or why water forms circles when it falls on the ground. Teachers often said he had a curious mind, though some thought he overthought everything. But there was one teacher who saw something more in him, the math teacher. She was strict but fair. Everyone respected her, and she had a reputation for being tough. Every test she gave had at least one question that left students scratching their heads. She believed that a person's real ability wasn't just about solving what's written in the book, but about how they think when the answer isn't there. And for this final exam, she had prepared something even more unusual, a question that no one had ever solved before. People said even she didn't know if there was an answer. When the test paper was handed out, everyone's eyes widened. There it was, printed at the bottom. The impossible question. The question looked simple at first, but the more you read it, the less sense it made. It wasn't a trick or a riddle. It was a genuine mathematical problem that had stumped minds for years. The teacher had found it in an old university archive where it was listed as unsolved. She added it as a bonus question, saying, "You don't have to solve it for marks. It's there for those who like a challenge." The class groaned. Most students ignored it and went straight to the regular questions. But the quiet boy couldn't take his eyes off that one strange question. Something about it drew him in. The way it looked impossible made it even more interesting. He didn't think about marks or grades. He just wanted to understand it. That evening, while everyone else celebrated the end of exams, he sat by his small study table with the paper still in front of him. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small desk lamp. His mother called him for dinner, but he barely heard her. His mind was spinning around that one question. He took a notebook and began writing down numbers, diagrams, and random thoughts. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Still no answer. But giving up didn't even cross his mind. For days he carried that question with him everywhere. On the bus, at the park, even while helping his parents at home. He scribbled on scraps of paper, drew shapes on fogged windows, and filled notebooks with ideas. He wasn't obsessed for fame or recognition. It was more like a personal promise. He just had to find out why it couldn't be solved. Maybe, he thought, it wasn't about solving it, but seeing it differently. At school, his classmates laughed a little. "You're wasting your time," one said. "Even teachers can't solve that." "What makes you think you can?" He didn't argue. He just smiled quietly and said, "Maybe they looked at it wrong." The teacher heard about his efforts but didn't say much. She only told him, "Some questions don't have answers, and that's okay. It teaches us to accept limits." But deep inside, she admired his persistence. Every night, the same routine repeated. The clock ticked, the streetlights flickered through his window, and he sat with his pencil tapping softly against the desk. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and imagine the question as a puzzle, not numbers, but shapes and relationships. He'd whisper to himself, "There's something missing, something small that changes everything." One evening, something strange happened. As he stared at the problem again, he realized something no one else seemed to notice. The question assumed a rule that everyone accepted. But what if that rule was wrong? What if the problem was impossible, only because people were solving it inside a box that shouldn't exist? He leaned closer, his pencil moving faster now. He started rewriting it, removing one assumption, rearranging it from a new angle. The lines began to make sense in a way they never had before. His heart raced. Could it be that simple? Could everyone have missed it because they believed it had to follow a certain pattern? For hours, he double-checked every step, making sure it wasn't just a lucky coincidence. Then he saw it. The logic was sound. The numbers balanced perfectly. He had done it. He had actually found a solution that made the impossible make sense. But instead of shouting or celebrating, he sat there quietly, just staring at his paper. A small smile spread across his face. He didn't know if anyone would believe him. It didn't matter. For the first time, he felt like he understood something deeper than math. He understood that sometimes the biggest limits are the ones people create in their minds. The next morning, he carried his notebook to school. When the teacher asked if anyone had attempted the last question, no one raised a hand except him. The class turned to look. "You tried it?" Someone whispered, half mocking, half curious. The teacher smiled faintly. "All right then," she said. "Let's hear what you found." He walked up to the board, nervous but steady. His hands shook a little as he wrote the equation step by step. The room was silent except for the sound of chalk scratching. At first, everyone looked confused, but then the teacher leaned forward, eyes narrowing as she followed his logic. He explained calmly, showing how the problem wasn't unsolvable at all. It was just asked in a way that made people overlook one small possibility. When he finished, he turned to the teacher, who stood still for a long moment. "That's interesting," she finally said softly. The class didn't know what to make of it. The teacher took his paper and told him to wait after class. His heart pounded as everyone left the room, whispering about what just happened. When the last student left, the teacher turned to him. "How did you come up with this?" she asked. He shrugged. "I just looked at it differently." The teacher didn't say anything more, only nodded slowly. She asked to keep his paper. He left the room, unsure what that meant. All day his mind spun. Did she believe him? Did she think he cheated? Or did she actually see what he saw? When he got home, his parents noticed something different in him. He wasn't nervous or restless anymore. He seemed calm, like someone who had found what he was looking for. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about the teacher's face when she saw his solution. There had been surprise there, maybe even pride. The next day at school, she didn't bring up the question. But when the results came out a week later, there was a small handwritten note on his paper. "See me after class." His heart skipped a beat. After everyone left, she closed the door and handed him his test. "I sent your answer to someone," she said. "A professor at the university. I wanted another opinion before I told you anything." His eyes widened. "A professor?" She nodded. "It may take some time, but I think you did something special." For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. The impossible question had done something no exam ever could. It made his teacher believe in him. Walking home that day, he couldn't stop smiling. He didn't know what would happen next, but deep inside, he knew that one small problem had just changed the course of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Days turned into weeks, and though he went back to his normal routine, something inside him had changed. He didn't talk about what he had done, but the thought of that test question never left his mind. Every time he walked into the classroom, he wondered if his teacher had heard back from the university professor. He tried not to think about it too much, but late at night, he would catch himself staring at his notebook, tracing over the same lines of logic he had written weeks ago. Then one morning, as he entered school, the teacher called him aside. "Come to the staff room during the break," she said in a calm tone. He nodded quietly, though his heart immediately started beating faster. The rest of the class passed in a blur. He couldn't focus on anything. When the bell finally rang, he gathered his books and walked toward the staff room with hesitant steps. Inside, the teacher was sitting with another person, a man he didn't recognize. The man wore glasses and had a warm smile, but there was something sharp and observant in his eyes. "This is the student I told you about," the teacher said. The man nodded. "So you're the one who solved the unsolvable question," he said with a small grin. "Sit down. Let's talk." He sat quietly, unsure what to say. The man introduced himself as a professor from a nearby university. He explained that he had received the paper and reviewed the work carefully. "At first I thought it must be a mistake," the professor said. "But when I checked your reasoning, it made sense. Not just mathematically, but conceptually. You approached it from a direction most people wouldn't even think of." The boy's hands fidgeted in his lap. He didn't know what to say, so he simply whispered, "I just wanted to understand it." The professor nodded, smiling. "That's what true learning is about. Most people stop at what they're told is impossible. But you didn't. You asked why." The teacher looked proud but also a little emotional. "I wanted him to hear it from someone who understands what he's done," she said. The professor leaned forward. "You know, I've been teaching for 20 years. I've seen bright students, creative thinkers, and hard workers. But what you did, and that's something rare, you questioned the problem itself, and that's how real discoveries begin. For a moment he didn't know how to react. The words felt heavy, almost unbelievable. All he could manage was a quiet, "Thank you." The professor chuckled softly. "Don't thank me. Keep thinking the way you do. It'll take you places." When he left the staff room that day, the world around him felt brighter. The sunlight seemed warmer, the air fresher. He had walked into that room as an ordinary student, but walked out feeling like maybe, just maybe, he was capable of something bigger than he ever imagined. Still, he didn't boast about it. He didn't even tell anyone what had happened. It felt too personal, too special, like a secret between him, his teacher, and the universe itself. A few days later, however, things began to spread. Someone must have overheard a conversation, because whispers started floating around the school. "Did you hear? He solved that impossible math question," one student told another. Soon the story was everywhere. Some students were amazed, some were doubtful, and a few just refused to believe it. "No way," one said. "He probably just got lucky." But luck couldn't explain the note from a university professor that soon arrived, a letter addressed to his teacher, praising the solution and mentioning that it had been discussed among other faculty members as an example of creative mathematical thinking. The teacher shared it with the principal, who called him into the office the next day. "You've made our school proud," the principal said with a big smile. "You've shown what real effort and imagination can do. I want you to speak at the morning assembly tomorrow." The boy froze. Speak in front of the whole school? He'd never done that before. But the principal insisted. "Just tell them what made you keep trying." That's all. That night he barely slept. He stood in front of the mirror, rehearsing what to say, but couldn't find the right words. Finally, he decided not to prepare at all. He'd just speak from the heart. The next morning, as he walked up to the stage, the crowd of students and teachers stared up at him. His hands trembled and his voice was shaky at first. But as he looked out at the faces, curious, skeptical, hopeful, he began to relax. "I didn't solve it because I wanted to prove anything," he said softly. "I solved it because I couldn't stop thinking about it. I just wanted to understand it. And I think sometimes the only way to find answers is to stop being afraid of not knowing." The hall fell silent. Then slowly people began to clap. It wasn't wild applause, and it was gentle and sincere. The teacher smiled proudly from the corner, her eyes shining with quiet pride. After that day, something shifted. Teachers started giving him harder questions. Students who used to ignore him now asked for help. But he didn't let it go to his head. He still spent evenings at his desk, studying quietly. Not because he had to, but because he loved learning. Still, the moment kept replaying in his mind. The professor's words, the teacher's smile, the applause in the hall. One evening, as he was walking home, his teacher called after him. "I have something for you," she said, handing him an envelope. Inside was a letter of invitation from the university. They wanted him to visit their mathematics department, to meet a few professors who were curious about his thought process. "They want to hear how you came up with it," she said with a grin. His heart skipped a beat. A university, and a real university, and wanted to talk to him. He looked up, almost speechless. "But I'm still in school," he said. The teacher laughed softly. "Yes, but talent doesn't wait for age." The following week, he and his teacher traveled to the city. The campus looked huge compared to his small school. Tall buildings, students rushing between classes, and a quiet buzz of conversation everywhere. When he entered the mathematics hall, several professors greeted him warmly. They asked him questions about how he had thought of his solution, what inspired him, and whether he had any interest in studying higher mathematics in the future. He answered honestly, sometimes hesitantly, but always with sincerity. One of the professors leaned back in his chair after hearing him out. "What I like about your thinking," he said, "is that you're not afraid to make mistakes. Most people think solving problems is about being right, but real discovery happens when you're not afraid to be wrong first." That sentence stayed with him for a long time. It felt like the key to everything he had ever believed without knowing how to say it. When they left the university that day, the teacher looked at him proudly. "You did well," she said. He smiled shyly. "Thank you for believing in me." She shook her head. "You earned it. I just gave you the space to try." On the way back, sitting on the bus as the city lights blurred by, he looked out the window and thought about how one question, one impossible question, had changed so much. It had started as just another test problem, but now it had opened doors he didn't even know existed. Over the next few months, the story spread beyond the school. A small local newspaper published a short article about him, calling him the boy who solved the unsolvable. People in the town began recognizing him. Neighbors congratulated his parents. Strangers smiled at him in the marketplace. But he remained the same, humble, quiet, always lost in thought. Sometimes at night, he'd look back at that first evening, when he sat at his desk under the dim lamp, staring at that paper. He'd think about how close he was to giving up, how easy it would have been to toss the paper aside like everyone else. But he didn't. Something inside him kept whispering, "Try again." And that small voice had changed everything. He didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he had one. The world seemed full of puzzles waiting to be understood. And maybe, just maybe, he was meant to solve some of them. Months passed, and life began to change in quiet but noticeable ways. The story of the boy who solved the impossible test question had started to travel beyond his small town. It began with a small article in the local paper, then another piece in a regional education magazine. People loved the idea. A young student with nothing but determination and curiosity, managing to do something that adults with advanced degrees couldn't. It gave people hope. It reminded them that intelligence wasn't about where you came from, but how deeply you cared to understand something. At first, he didn't even realize how far the story had spread. His teacher was the one who told him. One morning, she walked into class holding a stack of letters. "These are for you," she said, placing them on his desk. He looked up in surprise. "For me?" She nodded. "From teachers, students, and even a few professors. They read about what you did." He sat there quietly as his classmates watched in awe. He opened one letter, then another. Some congratulated him. Some asked for advice, and others simply said how his story inspired them not to give up on their own challenges. For someone who had always felt invisible, it was a strange feeling. He wasn't used to attention. He didn't know what to do with it. He still wore the same old backpack, still sat in the same seat by the window, still walked home through the same quiet streets. But something inside him felt different. Not pride exactly, but purpose. A few weeks later, a reporter from a national education magazine came to interview him. The school arranged a small meeting in the library. The reporter was kind, curious, and clearly impressed by his work. "Can you tell me what went through your mind when you first saw the question?" she asked, voice warm but professional. He thought for a moment, then said, "It just didn't feel right. Everyone said it was impossible, but I didn't believe that. I thought maybe people stopped too early. Maybe they stopped before asking why it seemed impossible." The reporter smiled, clearly moved by his words. "Do you realize how rare that kind of thinking is?" she asked. He shrugged shyly. "I just didn't want to quit." The article came out a few weeks later with his photo, sitting at his desk, a gentle smile, and the headline that read, "The student who solved the problem that stumped everyone." The story went viral faster than anyone expected. Teachers discussed it in staff meetings. Schools shared it as motivation during assemblies. Some parents even cut out the article and pinned it to their children's study walls as a reminder to never give up. The attention brought new experiences, invitations to speak at events, letters from universities offering scholarships, and even a small segment on a local TV channel. When the crew came to his house to film, his parents were nervous. His mother kept fixing his collar while his father stood in the background smiling proudly. When the interviewer asked how he felt about everything that happened, he said softly, "I'm happy people found hope in it. But the truth is, I just followed my curiosity." Despite the fame, he stayed grounded. He didn't chase popularity or show off. He kept his routine, waking early, going to school, reading late into the night. But something new had begun to grow inside him, a sense of confidence. He started helping other students who struggled with studies. He tutored younger kids after school, explaining things slowly and simply. He discovered that teaching gave him the same joy as solving problems. Watching someone else's eyes light up when they finally understood something was just as rewarding. One afternoon, while helping a group of students, his teacher stopped by and watched quietly. When the others left, she said, "You've changed." He looked puzzled. "How?" she smiled. "You used to hide behind your books. Now you share what you know. That's growth." He nodded slowly, realizing she was right. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just learning for himself. He was learning to help others too. Around that time, a letter arrived from the university professor who had first reviewed his work. The professor invited him to join a summer research program for high school students with exceptional problem-solving abilities. It was a short program, just a few weeks long, but it was an opportunity to work alongside some of the brightest young minds in the country. His teacher helped him apply, and soon he received the acceptance letter. The campus was different this time. He wasn't just visiting, he was part of it. The program brought together students from different cities, each with their own strengths. Some were brilliant with numbers, others with theories, and a few with computers. At first he felt out of place, worried he might not fit in. But that changed quickly. When the group was given a complex challenge to solve together, his calm, thoughtful approach stood out. He didn't rush. He listened, observed, and then quietly suggested ideas that others hadn't considered. One of the mentors noticed his way of thinking. "You see patterns most people miss," she told him. "That's not something we can teach, and it's something you're born with." He smiled politely, not knowing how to respond. But those words stayed with him. During the final week of the program, the students presented their projects. His group had worked on a problem involving how to simplify a complex model using new logic, something that built upon the same kind of thinking he had used for the impossible question. When they finished their presentation, the professors applauded. Afterward, one of them approached him and said, "I remember reading about you. You have a gift. Use it wisely." When he returned home, he felt like a new person. The town looked smaller somehow, but it wasn't in a bad way. It just reminded him of where he came from, of the quiet streets and late nights when it all began. His parents welcomed him back with open arms. His teacher was waiting at school, smiling proudly as she heard about his experience. "See?" she said. "That one question really did change your life," he nodded. "It did, but not just because I solved it. It taught me how to think differently." As the months rolled on, he began receiving letters from universities abroad, institutions offering him scholarships for when he graduated. It felt overwhelming, but he never forgot the simple beginning, the night under the yellow desk lamp when it all started. Despite all this success, he stayed humble. He still helped his classmates, still visited his teacher after school for advice, and still spent hours at his desk exploring new problems. Sometimes, when younger students asked him how he managed to solve something that no one else could, he would just smile and say, "By not believing that it was impossible." But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't just about intelligence or luck. It was about patience, persistence, and the courage to look at something differently. The impossible question had given him much more than recognition. It had taught him who he was and what he was capable of becoming. One night, sitting by his window, he looked up at the stars. The sky was clear, filled with tiny shining dots that looked like endless possibilities. He realized that just like those stars, every problem, no matter how distant or difficult, had its own kind of light, waiting for someone brave enough to look closely. He didn't know what the future would bring. Maybe more challenges, maybe failures too. But he wasn't afraid anymore. The world felt wide open, full of mysteries to explore. And he had found the courage to ask the kind of questions that could change everything. And though he couldn't have known it then, that quiet belief, that refusal to give up when faced with the impossible, would continue shaping his journey in ways even greater than he could imagine. As time went on, life began to unfold in ways he never expected. The once quiet boy who had spent long nights solving problems under a dim lamp was now being recognized in places he had never been. His story had gone beyond classrooms and small-town papers. Educational websites, podcasts, and even television programs had started to mention him, the student who saw what others missed. It sounded almost unreal, even to him. Despite the growing attention, he still lived the same simple life. He woke early, helped his parents, went to school, and studied late at night. But now, his days were filled with letters, emails, and invitations from people who wanted to hear his story. Some asked him to share how he thought differently. Others wanted him to motivate young students who struggled with learning. He was shy by nature, but something inside him told him to say yes. He realized that maybe his story wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been told they couldn't do something. The first event he spoke at was in a nearby college auditorium. When he walked onto the stage, his heart raced. The bright lights made it hard to see the faces in the audience, but he could feel the silence, everyone waiting for him to speak. For a moment he froze. Then, remembering the words of his teacher, "Just speak from the heart," he took a deep breath and began. He told them how it all started, how he spent endless nights trying to solve a problem that others had given up on. He admitted that there were moments he almost gave up too, but something kept him going. A quiet voice in his head that whispered, "Keep trying." He told them that he didn't solve it to prove he was smart. He solved it because he wanted to understand. The audience listened closely, and when he finished, they stood and clapped for a long time. Some even came up afterward just to say thank you. That night, as he walked home with his teacher, he felt something powerful. Not pride, but purpose. Soon, invitations started coming from far and wide. Schools, universities, even educational foundations wanted him to speak. Each time he spoke with the same simple honesty. He didn't use big words or fancy phrases. He just told his truth, that curiosity, patience, and persistence could turn the impossible into something possible. One day, an email arrived from a National Science Council. They wanted to feature him as part of a youth innovation conference. He was one of the youngest people ever invited. The event was held in a large city auditorium filled with scientists, professors, and students from across the country. He felt small among so many great minds, but when it was his turn to speak, something remarkable happened. Instead of talking about equations or theories, he talked about perspective. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the answer isn't in the numbers. It's in how we choose to look at them." The audience went silent, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. They could see that his way of thinking went beyond books. It was about life itself. After the session, a few scientists approached him. One of them said, "Your thinking isn't bound by what you're taught, and that's what makes you special." Another added, "You remind us why we started doing science in the first place and to ask questions without fear." Those words stayed with him for a long time. He began to see that what he had done wasn't just about solving one problem. It was about showing others that boundaries exist only until someone decides to cross them. His teacher, who had always been his quiet supporter, watched with pride. She once told him, "The world is full of people who say it can't be done. You're proof that it can." Hearing that made him smile. He knew that no recognition or applause could ever mean as much as her belief in him. But life wasn't just about success. With recognition came challenges too. The more attention he got, the more people expected from him. Reporters wanted new stories. Academics wanted him to solve other problems. Some even criticized him, saying it was just luck or coincidence. At first, those comments hurt. He began to doubt himself again, wondering if he really was special or if it had all just been a fluke. One evening, while sitting at his desk, lost in thought, his father quietly entered the room. "You look worried," he said. The boy sighed. "People think I just got lucky." His father smiled kindly. "Maybe you did, but even luck only finds those who work hard enough to meet it halfway." Those words comforted him more than anything else could. So he kept going. He didn't try to prove anyone wrong. He simply kept learning, kept asking questions, and kept teaching others to do the same. He began helping his school organize workshops for younger students, encouraging them to think differently and explore their curiosity. He started saying, "There's no such thing as a stupid question, only a question that hasn't been explored yet." Over time, his town began to change too. Students who once avoided math or science began to see them as something exciting. Teachers started creating open-ended questions inspired by his story. The once quiet classroom now buzzed with curiosity. His teacher often smiled as she watched it all unfold. A ripple effect started by one small act of persistence. Then, one day, he received an unexpected letter. It was from the same university professor who had reviewed his paper long ago. The letter said that an international research group had taken interest in his method of thinking and wanted to discuss his approach for a new educational study. They believed his story could inspire changes in how problem-solving was taught in schools. It felt unreal. He wasn't a scientist or a researcher. He was just a student who refused to give up on one question. But here he was, being asked to share his thoughts with people who had spent decades in the field. With his teacher's encouragement, he agreed. When he entered the large conference room filled with professionals from around the world, he felt nervous at first. But when they began asking him how he thought, his shyness faded. He spoke about how curiosity works, how sometimes when you stop worrying about the right answer, the answer finally appears. The experts listened intently, nodding and taking notes. Afterward, one of them said, "You may not realize it yet, but your way of seeing things could change how we teach the next generation." That night, sitting in his hotel room, he looked out at the city lights below. He thought about his small hometown, his teacher, his parents, and the quiet nights he'd spent struggling with that impossible question. He realized that everything that had happened, every moment of doubt, every failed attempt, every restless night, had led him here. He picked up his notebook, the same one he'd carried since that first test, and flipped through the old pages filled with messy scribbles and half-erased calculations. At the end of one page, he found a small line he had written months ago, almost without thinking. "There's always a way, if you keep looking." He smiled. Maybe that was the real lesson all along. The next day, he gave his final presentation at the conference. He didn't speak about formulas or numbers. He talked about human potential, about how every person, no matter where they come from, has the ability to do something remarkable if they refuse to stop questioning. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. But more than that, people came up to him not to congratulate him, but to thank him. In that moment, he realized something powerful. Solving that question had given him more than knowledge. It had given him a voice, a way to reach people, and a message that could inspire change. As he returned home that week, the world around him seemed both bigger and smaller at the same time. Bigger because he now knew there were endless things to discover, and smaller because he understood that greatness doesn't start in big cities or grand institutions. It starts quietly, in small rooms with people who dare to believe that even the impossible can be solved. And though his journey was far from over, he now understood that what he had found was not just an answer, but a purpose, one that would continue guiding him for the rest of his life. The years that followed were unlike anything he had imagined when he was just a quiet boy, sitting in a small classroom, staring at an impossible question. His name had slowly spread across places he had never been, yet he still carried the same notebook, the same handwriting, and the same habit of thinking deeply about everything. What changed most was not his surroundings, but the way he saw the world, and how the world saw him. He had become known as someone who made learning feel human again. Schools invited him not because he was a genius, but because he had a story that touched hearts. He talked about struggle, about patience, about not giving up even when nobody believed in you. His words weren't from textbooks. They came from experience. But with time, something began to shift inside him. The attention, the travels, the events, and they were all good. But he started to feel a quiet emptiness, a small question forming inside. What now? He realized that solving that one problem had opened many doors for him. But it had also created a kind of pressure. People expected him to keep solving new, impossible things to always surprise the world. But he didn't want to live chasing applause. He wanted to go back to what he loved most, the joy of learning for its own sake. So, one afternoon, he sat by his window, looking at the same sky he used to stare at as a boy, and made a quiet decision. He would step away from the noise and focus on something bigger, something that would outlast fame. He decided to create a place where young minds could explore without fear of being wrong. A place where failure wasn't something to hide from, but something to learn through. He shared this idea with his teacher, who was now much older but still full of wisdom. She listened with gentle eyes and said, "That's the best thing you can do. You've already proven yourself. Now help others find their own answers." Together they began planning. They gathered books, found a small building, and slowly turned it into a learning center. The walls were simple, painted with bright colors. There were shelves full of old and new books, blackboards, and even a few computers donated by local businesses. On the front wall, he hung a handwritten sign that said, "Every question matters." Students from nearby towns started coming, curious to meet the boy who solved the impossible question. But instead of lecturing them, he sat with them. He asked them what they wanted to understand, what confused them, what made them curious. He didn't teach them answers. He taught them how to look for answers themselves. He made learning feel like a journey, not a race. When a student got frustrated, he would smile and say, "It's okay. I've failed more times than I've succeeded. That's how I got here." Slowly, the room began to fill not just with laughter, but with hope. Over time, his small center grew into something bigger. Volunteers joined. Former students came back to help new ones. Parents noticed that their children started asking more questions at home, not out of doubt, but out of wonder. The town that once saw education as just a formality was now becoming a place of curiosity. One evening, while cleaning up after a long day, he found an old newspaper clipping stuck between two books. It was the very first article ever written about him. Student solves impossible question. He smiled, remembering the excitement of those days. But as he read it again, he realized something new. The story had always been less about solving the question and more about why he had tried in the first place. He had wanted to prove that no problem is truly impossible if you believe in your own way of thinking. That belief had carried him through failures, through doubt, and through years of learning. It was never about fame. It was about faith. Faith and persistence. That night, he took out his old notebook again, the one filled with his scribbles and formulas. Near the end, he wrote a new line. "The answer is never the end. It's the beginning of another question." Years passed, and the center became known far beyond the town. New teachers joined, workshops were held, and students from across the region visited. Some of them went on to become engineers, doctors, or teachers. Others simply carried his lessons into their everyday lives, to stay curious, to stay kind, and to never stop asking why. He didn't seek recognition anymore. In fact, most people who visited the center had no idea that its founder was once the boy who had shocked the world with a single answer. He didn't correct them. He preferred it that way. The story wasn't about him anymore. It was about everyone who dared to try. One winter evening, many years later, he received a letter. It was written in a neat, childlike handwriting. The letter said, "Dear sir, my teacher told me about you. She said you once solved a question that nobody could answer. I wanted to tell you that yesterday, I tried something very hard too. I didn't solve it, but I kept trying, just like you said. I think one day I will. Thank you for teaching us to keep going." He read that letter several times, his eyes quietly filling with tears. It reminded him why he had started all of this, not to be remembered, but to inspire others to believe in themselves. Later that night, as he walked home under the cold sky, he passed by the old school where everything began. The building was different now, newer, brighter. But as he stood outside the classroom window, he could still picture his younger self sitting at that desk, confused yet determined, with the question paper in front of him. He smiled. "That question didn't just change my life," he whispered softly. "It gave it meaning." As the years continued to roll by, he kept teaching, kept learning, and kept encouraging others to see problems as possibilities. His name became less spoken, but his influence grew quietly, like roots spreading under the soil. The world forgot the story of the boy who solved the impossible question. But hundreds of new stories began because of him. When he grew old, his hands shaky but his mind still sharp, he often sat outside the center, watching children run in with books and bright eyes. Sometimes one of them would stop and ask, "Did you ever solve something impossible?" He would smile, lean forward, and say, "Maybe once. But what's more important is that you'll solve your own one day." And that's how he lived, peacefully, purposefully, without the need for fame or recognition. In the end, he realized that the greatest thing he had ever done wasn't solving that question. It was showing others that they could. Years later, after he passed away, people in his town gathered to honor his memory. They placed his old notebook inside a glass case in the center's library. The pages were yellow and fragile, but the words still shone clearly. There's always a way if you keep looking. Visitors from different places came to see it. Some came out of curiosity, others for inspiration. A young boy once asked his teacher, "Was he really that smart?" The teacher smiled and replied, "He was smart, yes, but more than that, he never gave up. That's what made him special." The boy nodded, touched the glass gently, and whispered, "Maybe one day I'll find my own impossible question." And so, his story lived on, not through headlines or awards, but through the quiet courage of those who kept believing in their own minds. His legacy wasn't written in books or newspapers. It was written in the hearts of those he had inspired. Because sometimes, a single question can change a life. And sometimes, one life can change how the world looks at every question that comes after. Years passed quietly, and the world changed in ways no one could have predicted. Technology moved forward, new inventions came, and education transformed completely. But somewhere, in a small town surrounded by fields and narrow roads, there still stood a modest learning center with faded paint and an old wooden sign that read, "Every question matters." It had been many years since he passed away, but the air around that place still felt alive with his spirit. The benches he once sat on were still there, the chalkboard still marked with half-erased equations, and on the front wall, framed behind glass, hung his old notebook, the one filled with notes, scribbles, and that one powerful line, "There's always a way, if you keep looking." The world had not forgotten him completely. Schools taught his story as part of lessons about perseverance and creativity. Documentaries mentioned his name briefly, not as a celebrity but as a symbol of quiet determination. But in that small town, among those who truly knew him, he was remembered differently, not as a legend but as a friend, a teacher, and someone who cared enough to listen. The Learning Center was now run by one of his former students, a young man who had once been unsure of himself, but who had found direction through his mentor's words. Every morning he unlocked the old wooden doors, swept the floor, and made sure the small lamp by the window, the same kind his teacher once studied under, was always lit. He often said, "This light is a reminder that no matter how dark things get, curiosity will always find a way." Children still came there after school. Some came with books, others with simple questions that had no easy answers. One day, a little girl walked in holding a torn notebook and asked shyly, "Sir, is it true that someone once solved an impossible question here?" He smiled warmly. "Yes," he said. But what made it special wasn't the answer. It was the courage to keep asking. The girl nodded, still curious. "Do you think I could solve one too?" "Of course," he replied softly. "You already started and by asking that question." That conversation stayed in his mind long after she left. It reminded him of his own first day at the center, when he too had been scared of failure. Now, years later, he understood what his teacher had really given them, not knowledge, but belief. Belief that every person, no matter how ordinary, carried the power to discover something extraordinary. Every year, on the anniversary of his mentor's passing, the center held a small gathering. People from nearby towns would come, carrying candles and flowers. They would sit together, share memories, and read aloud from his old notes. Some of the pages were faded, but his words still spoke clearly about persistence, kindness, and the importance of thinking differently. One evening during the annual gathering, an elderly woman arrived quietly and stood near the back. She was frail, her hair gray and her hands trembling slightly as she held a bouquet of white flowers. It was his old teacher, the one who had once believed in him when no one else did. The crowd fell silent as she walked toward the front of the room. Her eyes filled with emotion as she looked at his picture, a simple photo of him smiling, his notebook clutched to his chest. She spoke softly, her voice breaking with age and memory. "I remember the first day he came to me with that question. Everyone thought it was impossible, and honestly, I almost told him to let it go. But there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't pride or stubbornness. It was curiosity, the kind that changes people." The room listened in silence. She continued, "He taught me more than I ever taught him. He showed me that real learning isn't about answers. It's about the courage to keep asking, even when the world tells you to stop." When she finished speaking, the crowd stood up and applauded gently, not out of sadness but gratitude. After the ceremony ended, the caretaker of the center helped her sit by the window where her former student had once worked late into the night. She touched the wooden table gently and whispered, "You did well, my boy. You did so well." A few weeks later, she passed away peacefully in her sleep. The townspeople buried her near the center, next to a small stone that already marked his resting place. Their graves stood side by side, teacher and student, forever connected by the story that had started with one impossible question. As the years went by, the world outside the town continued to grow faster, louder, and more complicated. Artificial intelligence, digital learning, and modern systems had made knowledge easy to find, but the human warmth behind it was fading. In that small town, however, things remained beautifully simple. The students still learned by asking, by experimenting, by failing and trying again. The center became a quiet symbol of what education truly meant. Not memorization, but exploration. Then one day, a new visitor arrived. He was a filmmaker from the city, searching for real stories of hope and resilience. He had heard faint rumors of a man who solved the impossible question and decided to see the place himself. When he entered the center, he was surprised by how humble it was. No trophies, no grand portraits, just walls covered with handwritten notes from students. At the front desk, he met the caretaker, who welcomed him warmly. "I've come to make a documentary about him," the filmmaker said. "I want the world to remember what he did." The caretaker smiled kindly and said, "You can tell his story, but don't make it about what he did. Make it about what he taught us to do." The filmmaker stayed for weeks interviewing townspeople, teachers, and students. He recorded the stories of those who had met him and those who hadn't but were inspired by his legacy. He captured children working on small projects, smiling proudly as they explained their ideas. When the film was finally released, it touched millions of people, but what surprised everyone was how quiet and sincere the story felt. There was no drama, no exaggeration, just the truth. A young boy, a hard question, a lifetime of learning, and a message that outlived him. After the documentary aired, donations poured in from across the world. People sent letters saying how his story had encouraged them to go back to school, to face failure, or to believe in themselves again. The center grew even more, not into something luxurious, but into something meaningful. New rooms were built, more children came, and yet the old desk by the window was never moved. It stayed right where it had always been, untouched, a silent reminder of where it all began. One night, the caretaker stood by that window, looking out at the stars. He whispered quietly, "You see? They still come. They still ask. You're still here." A soft wind moved through the room, and for a moment, it felt as though the light from the old lamp flickered on its own, like a nod from somewhere unseen. Decades later, when the caretaker grew old, he left behind a note for those who would continue after him. It said to keep the lamp burning. Someone out there is still searching for their impossible question. And so they did. Generations passed, but the story never faded. Children still came, still wondered, still believed. The town may have stayed small, but its impact reached far and wide. Through minds awakened, hearts inspired, and lives changed. Some stories end when the hero's journey is complete. But his story never truly ended. It lived on, in every student who refused to give up, in every teacher who chose to believe, and in every person who looked at a difficult question and thought, maybe there's a way, because once upon a time, a young student believed that no question was truly impossible, and that belief changed not just his life, but countless others after him. And that's how legends live, not in fame or glory, but in quiet rooms filled with hope, light, and the sound of young voices still daring to ask why.